In this video, we're going to have a look at expenses and how to configure it in the app. So the first thing to check is, has this feature been enabled? So we click up here and we can see that expenses doesn't appear in the menu, so we need to switch it on. So click on System Settings, User Types. That controls access for this particular type of user. And we click Edit and we just turn on expenses. Okay. If you have more than one employee and you want to have an approval process, i.e. people input their expenses and then they come through to a manager for approval, then you can also enable the approval process. But for a lot of small businesses, they won't require this. So we'll just keep it nice and simple and we'll just look at expenses. As soon as I've switched expenses on, I can now see two things. First of all, I can see the expense, and this is where I enter my expenses. But you've also got this other link down here in the system settings called expense types. And this is where typically you can set up your own expense types. And it'll come with a default list of expense types, and you can edit those and update those. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's click on expenses, and it's straight away going to show me all of the expenses between this date and this date. To add in a new expense, it's really simple. Just click on here, defaults to today, but you can change that date, and then you select the expense type. So I'm just going to select accommodation. I enter in the amount, say 90, and I type in, so this is hotel ABC. If they've sent you a bill, then you can just attach the receipt and you just click on save, and it's that easy. So sometimes when people are rushing, they forget to attach the receipt, and it's good practice really if you spend money on behalf of the business to record some sort of formal document just as proof that that bill existed. So we always prompt someone just in case they've forgotten to load the receipt. So do you want to enter a receipt? In this case, I'm just going to say no. So there's my accommodation entered. I'm just going to demonstrate another type of expense entry. So I'm going to click on Add. And this time, instead of choosing accommodation, I'm going to choose, this is mileage, okay, and it's paid per unit. So if I click on here, this time I don't enter in the amount, I enter in the total number of miles. So 182 miles at 45 cents or pence, and it calculates the amount for me, and then I input the journey details, to be. Okay, and I click on save, and this time, because we can configure this on the expense type to say what do we want to capture, and we're capturing some notes, but we don't actually need a receipt because we wouldn't get a receipt for this, so we just click on save. Okay, so that's how you enter your expenses. It's really easy. But as you're doing that, you can then look at the finance dashboard, and you can now see all the expenses being summarized, and there's a concept called drill through where you can click on it and it'll take you in and show you the detail behind it. We can just see the two expenses that we entered. Once again, this is really powerful because what it does is summarizes all the expenses you've entered in to date, the monthly average, and it takes the total to date plus the monthly average, and for the remaining months it'll tell you roughly how much it thinks you're going to spend this year. And there's another really nice feature down here, which is if you click on here, you can actually see a summary of all of your sales and a detailed breakdown of all of the expense types. I find this really useful because I can easily identify then that, oh, maybe I haven't entered in anything for this month. And it's really important to record all your expenses because that means that your profit is accurate and it avoids paying too much tax. So the final thing we'll look at is we'll look at the expense types. So we just go into system settings, and anything in the system settings you tend to update rarely. So normally you'd set up your expense types at the start of the year and that's it. So we'll just click on expense types and you can edit these expense types. So you can just click on it and you can edit the details. And if there's already expenses logged against this expense type but you no longer want to use it, you can just make it inactive. So it retains all of the data that's stored against that expense, but it doesn't allow people to enter in new data against it, so that's quite useful. So I'm just going to set up a new expense, and so there's really two types of expense. There's an ordinary expense like accommodation, or there's a per unit expense. And a per unit expense, you enable it and you say how much per unit, so for example mileage, and it would be per mile. Okay, so those are the two types. It's either a lump sum expense or it's a per unit, where the system calculates the value for you. You can say when you set up an expense, do you want to store a receipt against it? Do you want the employee to capture the receipt? And do you want them to enter in a description or some more information about this particular expense, which is quite useful, especially from an audit point of view. This down here is worth mentioning. So really, at its simplest, you don't need to worry about this. But in a slightly more sophisticated, as a larger company, you might have people who enter in their own expenses. Some of them might have a company card. So when an employee pays for expenses, they're totaled up and they need to be reimbursed. But if you could say that this expense type here is paid, for example, accommodation, you might an employee might have a company card and they might pay for it on the company card, at which point it needs to be reconciled to the bank account. Or you might say that you could have an expense, for example here, purchases, where you receive a supplier bill. So an employee wouldn't pay for it out of their own pocket. And also, do you want to permit accruals against this? So an accrual is where you know you've incurred a cost, but you may not have received the bill yet. And that tends to be an accounting thing. So it's not something you do every day, but you can say whether you want to permit an accrual to be entered in against this. It's slightly more complicated because you can then say, when you set up a user in the system, what they're permitted to do. So do they have a company credit card? Are they allowed to enter in supplier purchases? Are they allowed to do accruals? So it's quite sophisticated, but at its simplest, all you need to do is make sure that this is enabled. Okay, and that's how you set up expense types. Okay, so that's expenses, and it all looks really nice when you look at the dashboard and it all comes together. So I can see all my income, I can see all my expenses, I get a little forecast down here, and I can see my trading summary. And that's expenses.